Welcome. Tonight we drift into the life of a man whose footsteps stretched across continents and whose ideals tried to bridge kingdoms and republics. You settle yourself into a quiet place, and in your imagination the year is the mid-1700s. Rolling green hills of Auvergne spread before you, their slopes dotted with small villages, smoke curling gently from chimneys. You walk slowly up a winding path toward a grand chateau, where a young boy grows up surrounded by both privilege and loneliness. He is Gilbert de Mortier, later known as the Marquis de Lafayette, though here in his childhood the title feels more like an echo of family tradition than a destiny already written. The walls of his home hold tapestries and family portraits, reminders of ancestors who served kings and carried swords. Yet despite the wealth, you notice how silence often lingers in the corridors. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I would love for you to share in the comments your location and what time it is where you are listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the chateau, imagining the boy who would run down its long stone hallways. His father, a colonel in the king's army, has already been lost in battle, leaving Gilbert as heir to both land and responsibility. You picture him gazing at landscapes from tall windows, perhaps with the dreamy impatience of a child who wants something beyond what is placed before him. The hills are his playground, but also his fortress, enclosing him in a kind of gentle isolation. Historians still argue whether this solitude shaped his hunger for adventure, or whether it merely sharpened a natural restlessness. You join him on the grounds where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and tilled earth. He learns to ride horses almost before he can write his name. Imagine yourself guiding a young foal through dew-soaked fields, feeling both the pride and the wobble of uncertain steps. Laughter mixes with the sound of hooves, a reminder that privilege often carried with it endless practice for war and duty. By the age of 12, Gilbert already sits tall in the saddle, his eyes glancing toward distant horizons that seem to beckon. Inside the chateau, tutors whisper lessons of Latin and history, though his mind often drifts toward tales of knights and faraway lands. One detail that feels almost charmingly ordinary is his fondness for rustic food prepared by local cooks. Despite his noble rank, he sometimes slipped into the kitchens, curious about the smells of garlic and herbs. The servants may have chuckled, but it painted a portrait of a boy whose appetites were not entirely polished by aristocracy. The French nobility of his time prized connections above all. Families arranged alliances, marriages, and introductions that might advance their fortunes. You imagine sitting at a long dining table where relatives discuss prospects in hushed tones, while the boy pokes distractedly at his meal, not realizing yet that his own life will be steered by these currents. His mother's presence is both protective and distant, shaping him with expectation, but not always warmth. The loss of both parents at a young age leaves him with wealth and title, yet without the steady hands that might have guided his early heart. Wandering in the Auvergne hills, you picture him tracing paths through tall grasses, perhaps thinking about the stories he heard of noble knights defending causes greater than themselves. The countryside is quiet, save for birdsong and the occasional toll of a distant church bell. It is in these spaces that you sense his imagination stretching far beyond the provincial world around him. He learns discipline through hunting and riding, but also absorbs a kind of yearning that only solitude can deepen. A quirky little note often mentioned by biographers is his clumsiness at formal dancing. In an era when polished grace in the ballroom could signal power as strongly as bravery on the battlefield, Lafayette's awkward steps made him stand out. You smile as you imagine him tripping slightly during a carefully rehearsed figure, cheeks warming as older relatives raised their brows. It did not stop him from trying, but it hinted at a personality less concerned with aristocratic perfection and more drawn toward earnest effort. Still, duty hung heavy. His guardians arranged his schooling at the elite académie in Paris, where young noblemen prepared for careers in the king's service. As you walk alongside him in memory, you see a boy of privilege, tall and red-haired, arriving in the capital with both promise and naivete. Yet before that, he soaks up every detail of his childhood surroundings: the church bells, the whisper of wind through the chestnut trees, the stern stone faces carved into the family estate. This is where his journey begins, in the soft shadows of Auvergne, caught between childhood freedom and the early weight of aristocratic destiny. As you linger here, you might feel the contrast, the grandeur of halls filled with portraits and the quiet of fields where a boy dreams of adventure. He does not know yet that his path will lead across the ocean, or that he will one day be called a hero in two worlds. But you do, and so you rest with the knowledge that even great stories begin with the smallest of details: the crunch of boots on gravel, the flicker of a candle in a drafty hall, the sense that something vast lies beyond the horizon. You leave the hills of Auvergne behind and step into Paris, where light glimmers across polished floors and candles flicker in crystal chandeliers. The salons of the capital in the mid-1700s are less like mere rooms and more like entire stages, where conversation itself becomes a performance. You glide among finely dressed guests, silk rustling, perfume filling the air, and everywhere you turn, voices murmur about philosophy, politics, and the faint stirrings of change. You see Lafayette here as a youth, freshly arrived from his provincial upbringing, still carrying the awkwardness of his countryside manners. He tries to move with ease, but in such glittering company, every gesture feels measured. Imagine yourself seated in a corner, listening as a hostess welcomes writers, scientists, and nobles into her home. Salons are where ideas live and grow. Voltaire's sharp wit, Rousseau's restless musings, Montesquieu's visions of balanced power. Lafayette absorbs their names, perhaps not fully understanding each nuance yet, but sensing that words themselves can hold as much force as any musket or blade. Historians still argue whether his political ideals were shaped primarily by these early exposures, or whether they merely reinforced an inner disposition already leaning toward liberty. You watch him shift uncomfortably as formal dances or elaborate rituals of etiquette unfold. Though born to nobility, he never wears polish as naturally as some of his peers. His red hair and tall frame make him conspicuous, and his voice carries a trace of provincial accent that some aristocrats notice with raised brows. Yet it is precisely this difference that gives him a certain charm. He is earnest where others are calculating, sincere where others are polished. At one salon, he overhears a fiery discussion about the colonies across the Atlantic. Words like independence and representation drift through the candlelit air, ideas carried over by sailors, merchants, and diplomats. You lean in, hearing snippets about unrest in Boston, about a tea party that was not for sipping but for protest. Lafayette, still barely out of his teenage years, feels a thrill at the possibility of adventure hidden inside these stories. A detail less known but delightful is how often young Lafayette scribbled notes, not just about lessons in law and military science, but also about small observations, how people walked, how they laughed, what sparked their excitement. He was a watcher as much as a participant, eager to learn from the world around him. You picture him in a quiet corner of a salon, jotting down impressions while a violin plays softly in the background. Marriage comes early, arranged more as an alliance than as a romance, though affection grows with time. At 16, he weds Adrienne de Noailles, whose family stands among the most powerful in France. You sit with them at a dinner table, Adrienne composed and graceful, Lafayette attentive yet shy. She becomes a grounding presence, balancing his impulsive spirit with steady warmth. Their partnership, unusual in its sincerity for a political match, will later sustain him through storms of war and exile. As he integrates into Parisian life, Lafayette also begins military training, preparing to fulfill the role expected of a nobleman. You walk alongside him through drill yards, where young officers practice maneuvers, swords flashing under the sun. Yet the salons remain a contrasting world, a place where the sharp steel of ideas cuts just as deeply as blades. In both places, he learns, slowly building the foundation for the choices he will make when the chance to act arrives. The late Enlightenment hums around you as you move through these rooms. Lamps cast a soft glow, the air hums with conversation, and beneath the formality, you sense a quiet restlessness in the city itself. France is still firmly under the rule of Louis XV and later Louis XVI, yet currents of discontent ripple beneath the surface. Lafayette, listening more than speaking, soaks up the tension as if storing it for later. One quirky anecdote that surfaces in accounts of his youth is his occasional tendency to grow bored with courtly pomp and slip away to wander the streets. You imagine him dodging the stiffness of formal gatherings to instead walk among vendors selling roasted chestnuts or watch children chase each other in narrow alleys. These wanderings, though unremarkable at the time, helped him understand the humbler lives of ordinary Parisians, a perspective many nobles lacked. Through these years a pattern emerges. He is always pulled between worlds. On one side, salons rich with philosophy and aristocratic schemes. On the other, the restless energy of a young man who wants adventure, not just conversation. You sense him leaning toward action, a hunger beginning to stir that will not be satisfied with fine words alone. And in the glow of these salons, amid soft music and sharp debate, the seeds of his future commitment to liberty are quietly planted. The murmur of Parisian salons fades as you follow Lafayette into a new phase of restless yearning. He is now in his late teens, wealthy through inheritance, married into one of the most powerful families in France, and technically expected to live a comfortable, obedient life among gilded rooms and measured etiquette. Yet you feel his pulse quicken whenever talk turns to America, where colonies are beginning to resist the British crown. You picture him leaning forward during dinners, eyes bright, as visiting envoys describe uprisings, pamphlets, and the intoxicating idea of liberty across the sea. Historians still argue whether it was pure idealism or youthful impulsiveness that pushed Lafayette toward rebellion, but you sense the tug of both. He was inspired by Enlightenment ideas, yes, but also by a simple thrill at the prospect of risk. To join a revolution overseas was dangerous, illegal, and exhilarating. His family wanted him safe in court circles. His heart wanted adventure that might give meaning to all the privilege he inherited. You walk with him through Paris gardens one quiet evening. The lamps flicker, and he whispers to a trusted friend that he wants to cross the Atlantic to fight alongside these colonists for their independence. The friend stares at him, incredulous. Imagine yourself there, hearing the silence between them stretch out, the weight of such a decision settling like dew. Lafayette is barely 20, but his resolve is already sharp.
One quirky but telling detail, he first heard of the American cause at a dinner in Metz, where the Duke of Gloucester, brother of Britain's king, spoke disparagingly of the rebellious colonies. Where others might have brushed off the remarks, Lafayette felt a spark ignite. The very disdain of monarchy against rebellion made the rebellion seem noble to him. You smile at the irony. Criticism meant to belittle the colonists instead planted the idea in Lafayette Flat that he should join them. You sense the tension as plans take shape. He purchases a ship with his own money, defying both family and king. You stand on the dock beside him, the smell of salt and tar thick in the air, as carpenters hammer and sailors prepare the vessel. His relatives plead, his in-laws rage, even the king issues orders forbidding his departure, but Lafayette slips away, disguising his intentions. You imagine him moving quietly through back roads, a nobleman hiding his name, making his way to the coast like a fugitive chasing a dream. Historians debate whether his flight was more rebellion against family control or genuine devotion to liberty. Perhaps it was both, braided together. What you do know is that the journey itself was far from easy. Storms battered the ship, supplies ran low, and at one point British patrols threatened to intercept. You picture the deck at night, stars scattered overhead, young Lafayette clutching the rail and staring at the black horizon. His companions, hardened sailors, curse under their breath. Lafayette, in contrast, feels a thrill that he is at last breaking free. As the voyage stretches on, he studies maps, reads military texts, and dreams of how he might serve. He is not merely a passenger, but a student, eager to make himself useful. In quiet moments below deck, you imagine him scratching notes by lantern light, his handwriting jolting with each sway of the ship. The air smells of damp wood, salt and sweat, yet within his mind the image of America gleams brightly. A lesser-known tidbit whispers into this part of his story. He once entertained the sailors by awkwardly trying to learn their work, tugging on ropes, helping to scrub decks. They laughed at his lack of skill, but were charmed by his eagerness. It was this willingness to lower himself, even in jest, that made Lafayette endearing to men who might otherwise have dismissed him as just another pampered aristocrat. Finally, after weeks at sea, the shoreline appears. The sight of America, vast, green, and unfamiliar, fills you with the same wonder Lafayette must have felt. You imagine stepping onto the soil with him, the air warmer, the forests denser than anything back home. He is far from Paris salons, far from gilded halls and aristocratic judgments. Here he is not simply a nobleman, but a volunteer, a stranger offering himself to a cause larger than his own name. You feel the suspense of that moment, the gamble of leaving everything familiar, the uncertainty of what comes next. Lafayette does not yet know how he will be received or whether his courage will prove enough. But for now, the journey across the ocean is complete, and the quiet dream of liberty has carried him into a new world where his destiny will truly unfold. You step onto the rough soil of a new continent, the salty wind of the Atlantic still clinging to your clothes. Lafayette, barely 20 years old, looks out over a land alive with possibility, yet scarred by struggle. The American Revolution is not a polished affair of uniforms and parades, but a ragged campaign of farmers, tradesmen and soldiers, learning as they fight. You follow him inland, the roads muddy, the taverns smoky, the air carrying a spirit of urgency. At first, the American leaders are skeptical of this tall, red-haired French aristocrat who claims he has come to volunteer. You can almost hear their doubts whispered at long tables. Was he just another fortune-seeker, another nobleman chasing glory? Lafayette surprises them by offering to serve without pay, without rank, only for the chance to help. That gesture softens the suspicion, and slowly he earns trust. Historians still argue whether his wealth smoothed the way more than his idealism, but his sincerity quickly becomes clear to those who meet him. You walk with him into one of his earliest encampments. The tents are patched with rough cloth, the ground muddy from recent rains. Smoke curls from campfires where men roast meager rations. Lafayette, instead of holding himself apart, moves among the soldiers. He listens to their complaints, shares their food, even laughs at their crude jokes. One little-known tidbit is how fascinated he was by the democratic spirit of these men, farmers who dared to argue with officers, ordinary voices carrying weight in matters of war. It was unlike anything in France, and it stirred him deeply. His first battle comes at Brandywine in 1777. You find yourself on the edge of that field, the air sharp with gunpowder, the crack of muskets echoing across rolling hills. The Continental Army struggles against disciplined British troops, lines breaking, men retreating in confusion. In the chaos, Lafayette rides forward, rallying soldiers, his horse pushing through smoke and mud. A musket ball strikes his leg, blood seeping into his boot. Yet he does not flee. He orders his men to keep fighting, his voice carrying over the din. You can almost feel the sting of the wound, the heat of pain, the determination in his eyes. Carried from the battlefield, Lafayette refuses to sink into despair. Instead, he writes letters insisting that the cause is just and that his injury is a badge of honor. That moment wins him admiration. Washington himself begins to see him not just as an eager volunteer, but as a true ally. You sense how quickly the bond between them will deepen. In the weeks after Brandywine, Lafayette hobbles on crutches, yet continues to train and inspire men. Imagine him leaning on a wooden cane, watching soldiers drill, calling out encouragement in accented English. The soldiers, who once looked at him with suspicion, begin to cheer when he passes. He is still a foreigner, but he has bled beside them, and that is a language they understand. You notice how much he studies the tactics of the Revolution. He observes the differences between European warfare, formal lines, rigid discipline, and the rough, adaptive style of colonial militias. Instead of dismissing it, he admires their ingenuity. He even notes how women and families support the effort, cooking, nursing, and sometimes carrying supplies through dangerous terrain. To Lafayette, this is not simply war, but a new way of organizing society where common people claim dignity in the struggle. One quirky anecdote often mentioned is his fondness for joining campfire talks. Soldiers found it strange that a French noble would sit cross-legged on the ground, poking at embers, listening to their songs. He would try awkwardly to sing along, sometimes badly, but with such earnestness that the men laughed and accepted him as one of their own. Those quiet evenings under the stars, with the scent of wood smoke in the air, stitched bonds that no title could create. Historians debate whether Lafayette's military skill was truly exceptional, or whether his main gift was inspiration. Either way, you walk away from these early battles knowing that his courage and humility transformed suspicion into trust. He entered a revolution as an outsider, and through sweat, blood, and laughter began to weave himself into its fabric. As the year closes, you feel the rhythm of this foreign war pressing into his heart. He came chasing ideals, but now the ideals have faces, faces of weary soldiers, hungry children, and determined farmers. The American cause has become his cause, and his story will never again belong solely to France.
The air at headquarters feels calmer than the battlefield, yet heavy with decisions.
You step through the tent flaps of George Washington himself, the smell of parchment, wax, and faint wood smoke surrounding you. Washington rises tall, his presence steady and quiet, and Lafayette, still limping from his wound at Brandywine, bows with both respect and warmth. What could have been a formality grows into something far deeper. The older general, burdened with the weight of leadership, finds in this young Frenchman a companion whose eagerness feels genuine. You sense the moment like a spark, the beginning of a bond that will echo through history. Lafayette looks at Washington as more than just a commander. He sees in him a model of discipline, patience, and moral strength. You imagine Lafayette walking beside him through encampments, watching as Washington pauses to speak with ordinary soldiers, his voice firm but kind. Washington, in turn, is struck by Lafayette's willingness to learn, his loyalty, and his lack of arrogance. Historians still argue whether Washington saw him more as a son, a protégé, or simply a trusted friend, but their letters brim with affection and respect. You picture evenings by the fire where strategy gives way to conversation. Washington, who seldom allowed closeness, lets down his guard. Lafayette, eager to practice his English, asks endless questions about farming, governance, and American life. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. Lafayette often mispronounced common English words in charming ways, leading Washington to correct him gently. The soldiers nearby would chuckle, though never mock him, because his earnest attempts endeared him to all. As their bond deepens, Lafayette becomes more than a volunteer. Washington entrusts him with commands, giving him responsibility far beyond his years. You follow him into councils of war, where stern generals debate tactics. Lafayette sits quietly at first, then speaks with measured boldness. His youth could have made him an object of scorn, but Washington's trust shields him. The young Marquis earns respect not by demanding it, but by proving it again and again. At camp, you walk through rows of makeshift huts, soldiers nodding as Lafayette passes. He bends down to speak with them, asking about their families, their homes. One detail seldom mentioned is how he sometimes shared his own money to provide supplies or clothing for soldiers in need. It was not charity, but camaraderie, a gesture that built bridges across language and class. Imagine the gratitude in the eyes of a shivering soldier who suddenly receives a warm coat from the hands of a French aristocrat turned comrade. Washington, seeing this, grows ever more protective of Lafayette. Their relationship softens into something almost familial. Lafayette writes home calling Washington his adoptive father. Washington responds with care, reminding him to guard his health, to temper his zeal, to find patience in hardship. You can almost hear Washington's deep voice in the night air advising caution, while Lafayette's youthful energy pushes forward with enthusiasm. The balance between them becomes a partnership, age and youth, steadiness and fire. In one council meeting, debate rages over whether to risk another engagement against superior British forces. Lafayette listens, then speaks with quiet conviction, reminding them that courage itself has power to sustain morale. Historians debate how much influence he truly wielded in strategy, but the fact that generals listened to a 20-year-old foreigner speaks volumes about his growing stature. Another small anecdote. Lafayette was fond of riding long distances to deliver messages, relishing the speed and danger of it. On one occasion, he rode so recklessly that his horse stumbled and nearly threw him. Soldiers teased him for being too daring, yet admired his fearlessness. His laughter afterward, brushing dirt from his uniform, showed the playful side of a young man who still felt indestructible. Through these moments, you feel the warmth of the bond forming between Washington and Lafayette. In a war full of uncertainty, betrayal, and shifting allegiances, this friendship becomes a thread of constancy. Washington gains a son in spirit, Lafayette a father in wisdom. Together, they represent more than two men. They embody the meeting of old worlds and new, Europe and America, tradition and revolution. You leave them there for now, seated by a quiet fire in a cold tent, Washington's face lined with care, Lafayette's glowing with youthful hope. The smoke rises, the night deepens, and their voices blend into a companionship that will guide the revolution forward.
The winter of 1777 drapes itself over Valley Forge like a heavy quilt of frost and silence. You step into the encampment alongside Lafayette, the crunch of snow beneath your boots, the air sharp enough to sting your lungs. All around you stand rows of log huts, smoke curling faintly from their chimneys, the smell of thin stews and damp wood lingering. Soldiers huddle in threadbare coats, some with rags wrapped around bleeding feet, others too weak to stand for long drills. Hunger gnaws as fiercely as the cold, and you feel how each day stretches into endurance rather than triumph. Lafayette, still recovering from his leg wound, refuses to retreat into comfort. He walks through the camp, leaning slightly on a cane, pausing to speak with men whose spirits are low. Imagine him kneeling beside a fire where soldiers warm their hands, listening to their worries, offering small encouragements. Historians still argue whether his presence made any tactical difference during that harsh winter, but the soldiers remembered how this French nobleman, who could have sought safety, chose instead to share their misery. You wander with him to General Washington's headquarters, a farmhouse where candlelight glows against frosted windows. Inside, Washington pores over maps and letters, his expression weary but steady. Lafayette stands at his side, absorbing the lesson of leadership in hardship. Not grand victories, but the patience to endure when all seems lost. One little-known detail is that Washington sometimes urged Lafayette to rest, worrying over his health. Yet Lafayette, stubborn in his loyalty, answered with youthful defiance, insisting that his place was here, among the men. The days crawl into weeks. Snow piles high, and supplies remain scarce. Horses die from starvation. Shoes disintegrate. Yet training continues under Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer whose sharp discipline begins to mold the ragged army into a fighting force. You imagine Lafayette watching the drills, fascinated by von Steuben's mixture of blunt commands and occasional humor. At times he steps in to translate, his French accent wrapping it awkwardly around English words, drawing chuckles from the men. That blend of levity and discipline knits the camp together. At night, the camp quiets, except for coughing and the crackle of fires. Lafayette joins small gatherings around embers, sometimes sharing stories of France, tales of castles, hunts, and glittering salons. The soldiers listen with wide eyes, not in envy, but in curiosity, for his world seems as strange to them as their rough huts do to him. One quirky anecdote suggests that Lafayette once tried to cook a French-style stew for a group of soldiers, improvising with what little they had. The result was barely edible, but the laughter it sparked warmed the evening more than any fire. You walk out into the dark with him, snowflakes catching in his hair, the vast silence of winter stretching over the valley. He lifts his gaze to the stars, perhaps wondering if Adrian, back in France, looks at the same sky. Letters travel slowly, but in them he pours affection and longing. That thread of love, woven through distance and war, sustains him as surely as the cause of liberty. Historians debate whether Valley Forge was truly as desperate as later memory paints it, but standing here in the cold, you feel the weight of it. Shoes truly were scarce, hunger real, disease constant. What matters most, though, is how endurance transformed the army. Lafayette witnesses it firsthand. Soldiers who arrived weary and disorganized begin to march with rhythm, to load muskets with speed, to carry themselves with pride. The camp becomes less a place of despair and more a forge, shaping steel from suffering. And through it all, the friendship between Washington and Lafayette deepens further. You picture Washington placing a firm hand on his shoulder, reminding him that battles are not won only with muskets, but with resilience. Lafayette, in turn, writes to French contacts, urging support for the American cause, his words filled with both idealism and hard-earned reality. As winter thaws, the camp stirs with new life. The once shivering soldiers now march in order, muskets gleaming, spirits rising. Lafayette walks among them, no longer the untested foreigner, but a brother in arms. He has endured their hunger, their cold, their doubt, and in that endurance he has become woven into the very fabric of their fight. You leave Valley Forge with him in early spring, the snow melting into muddy paths, the air smelling faintly of thawing earth. Behind you lies a season of hardship, ahead the battles yet to come. For Lafayette, the winter has been not just survival, but transformation, a season that tempered his youthful fire with the quiet strength of endurance.
The snows of Valley Forge fade behind you as Lafayette prepares to return to France, carrying with him more than scars and memories. You picture him riding along spring roads, the air heavy with damp earth, letters tucked safely in his coat. These letters are precious, appeals from Washington and other American leaders to the French court, urging them to aid the struggling colonies. Lafayette knows he will not simply be a messenger, but a bridge between two worlds. When he sets sail back across the Atlantic, the ocean greets him again with its endless horizon. This time, the voyage feels less uncertain. He no longer comes as a reckless youth seeking adventure, but as a seasoned officer bearing proof of sacrifice. The wound in his leg aches when the sea air turns cold, a reminder of Brandywine, but he carries it as a badge of honor. Historians still argue whether he left America out of duty to his family or strategy for the Revolution, yet the fact remains that he carried the cause home in his heart. You step ashore with him in France, where gilded halls and glittering chandeliers once again surround him. Parisian salons buzz as always, yet now he speaks with a new authority. Imagine him at a polished table, telling of icy huts at Valley Forge, of ragged soldiers who marched barefoot, of Washington's quiet strength. Listeners lean closer, astonished that this nobleman chose to share such hardships. Some scoff, dismissing the colonists as rebels unlikely to win. Others, intrigued by Lafayette's conviction, begin to wonder whether France might yet profit from aiding them. Adrienne greets him with joy, their reunion tender after long separation. You stand at the threshold of their home, watching him embrace his wife, her eyes brimming with relief. She listens to his stories late into the night, the firelight dancing on their faces. It is not only duty but love that steadies him now, and Adrienne becomes his confidant, sharing in both his pride and his worries. In Versailles, he faces courtiers skeptical of the American cause, yet Lafayette's enthusiasm proves contagious. He describes Washington as a figure of almost mythic stature, painting him as a man of dignity and resolve. In doing so, he wins sympathy for the Revolution, not just through arguments of strategy, but by appealing to ideals and honor and justice. One quirky anecdote: Lafayette once sketched crude maps of America for courtiers, pointing out places like Valley Forge or Brandywine with a boyish excitement that sometimes made dignified ministers smile despite themselves. The king, Louis XVI, listens more cautiously. He weighs risks and alliances, the delicate balance of Europe, the eternal rivalry with Britain.
Lafayette presses, not with arrogance, but with earnestness. His youth, which might have been a liability, instead makes him appear sincere, unjaded by politics. Historians debate how much his influence truly swayed the court, but soon after his return, France began moving more decisively toward alliance with the colonies. His voice was not the only one, yet it was among the most passionate. You walk with him through the glittering gardens of Versailles, the fountains spraying high, powdered wigs and silks all around. Yet in his heart, Lafayette carries images of muddy boots and campfires. That contrast defines him, standing in gilded halls while hearing the echo of soldiers' laughter in crude huts. He embodies two worlds at once, and it is this duality that makes his presence so powerful. Letters flow back to America, Washington writing to him as though to a son. Lafayette treasures these words, keeping them close, rereading them in moments of doubt. The bond transcends distance, as if the Atlantic were no wider than the space between two close friends. One small tidbit rarely told. Lafayette once organized a dinner in Paris where he seated diplomats beside soldiers, philosophers beside merchants, all to discuss the American cause. The mixture puzzled some, amused others, but delighted him. He loved the idea of blending voices that seldom mingled, much like the Revolution itself blended farmers and nobles into comrades. By the time spring turns to summer, Lafayette has achieved what few could. He has returned not defeated, but strengthened, his reputation burnished both at home and abroad. He has carried American ideals into French chambers, where the air smells of polished wood and powdered wigs and planted seeds that will soon bear fruit. You leave him there, striding confidently through salons, a young man no longer just curious about liberty, but already shaping the destiny of nations. The hills of Auvergne may still echo in his memory, but now he stands at the very edge of history, poised between the old world and the new.
Back in France, Lafayette moves through a society of powdered wigs and silk gowns, yet his mind often drifts to the rough-hewn paths of America. You follow him as he navigates the labyrinthine streets of Paris, the clatter of carriage wheels echoing against cobblestones, vendors calling softly from open stalls, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the faint perfume of nobles passing by. The contrast is striking. His American comrades had marched through mud and snow, while here he steps over polished floors and velvet carpets. Historians still argue how much this return to opulence affected his ideals, but for Lafayette, the memory of hardship never fades. In salons, he is no longer merely a curious nobleman, but an envoy of experience. You watch him lean slightly forward in conversation, hands animated, as he recounts the winter at Valley Forge or the siege of Yorktown. His audience listens intently, some skeptical, some inspired. He emphasizes not military glory alone, but the courage and perseverance of ordinary men, the citizens turned soldiers who embodied a new concept of liberty. One quirky detail: Lafayette occasionally wore a faded American sash under his coat, a subtle nod to his allegiance, and some observant courtiers noticed it, whispering about this foreign intrigue. Adrienne stands faithfully by his side, her presence a soft anchor. Imagine her gently smoothing his hair after long days of diplomacy, her voice quiet but steady as she reminds him of home, of family, of small joys amid grand schemes. Their correspondence had been constant during his absence, each letter folded with care, sealed with hope. Now reunited, they share stories of the old world and new, blending laughter with reflection. Yet Paris is a city on the cusp of change. The economic strain and rising unrest among the populace seep through the gilded walls. Lafayette senses currents beneath the surface, the quiet rumble of discontent that will one day roar into revolution. You walk with him past crowded marketplaces where whispers of reform drift between stalls, and you feel the tension, curiosity mingled with unease. Historians still debate the extent of his foresight, but Lafayette clearly recognizes the potential for transformation. He also cultivates relationships with thinkers and philosophers, drawing wisdom from their measured counsel. You watch him seated among candle-lit bookshelves, debating quietly about the nature of governance, liberty, and equality. One little-known fact is that he sometimes carried tiny sketches of American towns in his pocket, referencing them to illustrate points about civic duty or militia organization. These small gestures bridge worlds, reminding those around him that theory has lived experience behind it. Lafayette begins to mentor younger nobles, subtly encouraging empathy and engagement with the broader population. You imagine him walking through gardens with a group of apprentices, pointing out the harmony of nature as a metaphor for balanced governance. He speaks softly, sometimes pausing to listen, valuing reflection over forcefulness. It is a style of leadership shaped in the frozen camps of America, where patience often mattered more than immediate action. One evening, Lafayette hosts a quiet dinner with a select group of reform-minded individuals. Candles flicker against the walls, the clink of porcelain soft in the otherwise hushed room. He shares stories of American victories and setbacks alike, drawing lessons not from triumph alone, but from perseverance, strategy, and moral courage. Guests leave thoughtful, sometimes changed in subtle ways. The weeks turn into months, and Lafayette remains a figure poised between worlds. You watch him traverse the streets, his mind occupied with letters, strategy, and the memory of soldiers' faces. His charm and sincerity open doors that wealth alone could not. The whispers of reform, the stirrings of change, and the echoes of his American experiences coalesce into a vision that is at once practical and idealistic. Through all of this, he carries an unassuming humility. When praised for American victories, he redirects credit to Washington, the soldiers, the people themselves. He understands that legacy is built quietly, in acts of service, in moments of reflection, and in courage sustained over time. This duality, noble by birth, revolutionary by conviction, defines him and will shape the coming decades of French history. Even as Paris glows with candlelight and celebration, Lafayette often steps outside at night, feeling the cool air on his face, recalling the wind-whipped fields of the New World. Stars stretch endlessly above him, as familiar now as they had been on the long Atlantic voyage. And you walk alongside him in these moments of quiet thought, sensing both the weight of responsibility and the gentle thrill of possibility.
The hum of Parisian life surrounds you as Lafayette begins engaging more directly with reformist circles, his footsteps soft against the stone streets while lanterns glow warmly in shop windows. You follow him into drawing rooms filled with debate, where philosophers and young nobles discuss liberty, justice, and the balance of power. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and the faint aroma of candle wax, and somewhere outside, the soft clatter of hooves reminds you that life continues beyond these walls. Lafayette listens as much as he speaks, occasionally leaning forward to share anecdotes from the American Revolution, drawing vivid parallels that captivate listeners. Historians still argue whether his words directly inspired the early political movements in France, but it is clear that his presence leaves a mark on those around him. One particularly gentle memory surfaces, Lafayette introducing a game of moral dilemmas at a dinner, asking each guest to consider difficult choices as if they were young officers in the Continental Army. Some laughed, some pondered deeply, yet all were engaged in a manner that was playful, yet subtly instructive. It is moments like these that reveal the softer side of a man often remembered for bold military exploits, moments of quiet intellect and gentle persuasion. Adrienne continues to be his anchor. You see them walking through quiet corridors late at night, discussing plans in hushed tones. Her wisdom and steadiness balance his idealism. She questions him gently when he grows too absorbed in visions of reform, reminding him of the practicalities of life and the nuances of human temperament. In these exchanges, the foundation of a lifelong partnership is clear, one built on mutual respect and shared ideals. Political tensions rise slowly in the streets. Lafayette notices the subtle unrest in markets and neighborhoods, whispers of economic strain and a longing for change among commoners. You walk alongside him through these areas, sensing both his curiosity and his empathy. He records these observations meticulously in journals and letters, sometimes sketching the layout of a bustling square or the faces of merchants and laborers. These small details reveal a man deeply attuned to the pulse of his society, even as he navigates the opulent halls of Versailles. One little-known fact is that Lafayette occasionally rode horseback at dawn through empty streets, relishing the calm before the city fully awoke. He used these quiet moments to reflect on the responsibilities he carries and the lessons he has learned from the American Revolution. Each gallop through misted avenues feels like a meditation, a gentle reminder that even leaders need space for contemplation. Lafayette also begins forming closer ties with the young leaders who will later become central to the French Revolution. You observe him listening carefully, offering guidance without imposing his authority. He encourages dialogue and independent thought, drawing from his own experiences, bridging worlds between soldiers, civilians, and foreign allies. His approach is subtle, never forceful, allowing ideas to grow organically, much like the saplings in the gardens he often strolls through. One curious anecdote: he once hosted a small informal evening where artisans and nobles shared ideas about governance and civic responsibility. Guests were initially skeptical, but Lafayette's charm and respect for all voices gradually dissolved tension. Conversations flowed into the night, the candlelight flickering on walls covered with portraits and maps, each guest leaving with a sense of participation in something quietly transformative. Through it all, Lafayette remains mindful of the lessons from his American experience: patience, perseverance, and the power of moral example. You walk with him along Seine-side quays, feeling the soft ripple of water against stone, imagining him drawing inspiration from these quiet observations as much from his formal engagements. Historians still debate how much these early efforts influenced revolutionary sentiment, but for Lafayette, each thoughtful conversation is a step in a larger journey toward understanding and change. Even in the midst of bustling salons and early revolutionary stirrings, Lafayette finds pockets of calm. He writes letters to Washington, updates his notes, and occasionally sketches scenes from both France and America. These moments allow him to process the duality of his existence: nobleman and reformer, soldier and thinker, husband and statesman. It is this balance, gently maintained, that will define much of the next chapter in his life. As night descends over Paris, you imagine Lafayette pausing on a balcony, the city lights mirrored in the Seine, contemplating the delicate tension between old structures and emerging ideals. The wind carries a soft promise of change, yet there is a patient stillness in his gaze, a readiness to witness history unfolding with measured grace. You sense that he understands the weight of responsibility, but also the quiet joy of being part of something larger than oneself, a story gently unfurling. Spring arrives in Paris with a subtle warmth, and Lafayette begins to take a more active role in political reform. You walk beside him through gardens where cherry blossoms fall softly onto gravel paths, petals drifting in the breeze as he meets with like-minded nobles who envision a more balanced governance. The soft hum of bees and distant church bells create a serene soundtrack for conversations that are serious yet never harsh. Historians still debate how much Lafayette's early advocacy influenced the subsequent National Assembly, but it is clear he becomes a gentle bridge between entrenched aristocracy and emergent revolutionary thought. In these quieter months, he continues refining his understanding of civic duty. You imagine him seated at a small wooden desk, ink lightly staining the edges of papers as he drafts letters to both friends and foreign allies. One little-known detail is that he would often doodle miniature maps and sketches in the margins, visual reminders of towns he had visited or imagined reforms taking root. This blending of artistic observation with political thought reflects a mind always at ease with reflection and creativity, a rare trait among men of action. Adrienne remains a constant presence, offering both counsel and companionship. You see her walking alongside him in sunlit corridors, whispering reminders of patience and prudence. Her laughter occasionally punctuates the serious discussions of governance, a soft cadence that keeps him grounded. Together they discuss the challenges of leadership, the balance between principle and pragmatism, and the quiet responsibilities that accompany public influence. The rhythm of their daily life carries a soothing stability amid the subtle tremors of societal change. Lafayette also nurtures relationships with ordinary citizens, often visiting neighborhoods where the effects of taxation and economic pressure are most apparent. You walk with him through narrow streets, observing his gentle attention to shopkeepers' concerns or the small communities gathering in shaded courtyards. Historians still argue whether these interactions shaped his broader political strategies, but his intent to understand lived experience is unmistakable. Evenings are filled with reflection and correspondence. He writes to Washington, discussing both military and political observations, and replies arrive with notes of encouragement and camaraderie. The connection between the continents remains vibrant, a quiet reassurance that ideals of liberty and civic responsibility transcend oceans. One quirky anecdote, Lafayette sometimes tucked pressed flowers into letters, a simple gesture linking personal sentiment with broader purpose. In salons, he continues to inspire thoughtful dialogue rather than command attention. You watch as he poses questions, encouraging debate over decree, weaving American experiences into French discourse with subtle charm. Guests leave conversations enriched and reflective, a testament to his patient approach. As spring deepens, Lafayette senses the undercurrents of public unrest growing stronger. Rumors of economic hardship and calls for representation reach even the polished corridors of Versailles. Yet he moves with calm determination, observing, listening, and preparing to act with measured care. You sense that for him, influence is most potent when wielded quietly and thoughtfully, a philosophy shaped by both the battlefield and intimate conversations with friends, mentors, and loved ones. Night falls over Paris, and you imagine Lafayette gazing at the city from a quiet balcony. Street lamps cast pools of gold on cobblestones, the air fragrant with blooming flowers. He reflects on both the small and large moments, the whispers of change, and the subtle joys of a life devoted to principle and gentle action. In this balance of observation, connection, and quiet anticipation, he cultivates both patience and vision, preparing for the years that will shape France in ways gentle yet profound. Summer in Paris arrives with a languid heat that softens the city's edges, and Lafayette moves among both the gilded salons and the quiet streets with an almost meditative rhythm. You walk beside him as he navigates the corridors of power, yet pauses to greet a vendor or nod to a child playing in the courtyard, the warmth of his presence felt by all he encounters. Historians still debate whether his connections in the early revolutionary circles were more symbolic than practical, but his consistent attention to people of all social strata quietly strengthens his influence and underscores his philosophy of balanced engagement. You observe Lafayette in these months as he convenes with fellow reformers, seated under the dappled shade of chestnut trees in private gardens. The soft rustle of leaves above and distant laughter create a serene backdrop for discussions about constitutional reform, civic duty, and the protection of individual rights. One little-known fact is that Lafayette often took meticulous notes in his own shorthand, a system that allowed him to capture fleeting ideas, reflections, and even jokes from conversations, a practice that offers a window into his meticulous yet playful mind. Adrienne accompanies him whenever possible, her presence both comforting and grounding. You watch them stroll along quiet streets at dusk, the air filled with the scent of summer blossoms and warm stone. They discuss not just politics, but also philosophy, literature, and the arts, weaving the everyday and the extraordinary together with a soft intimacy. She occasionally teases him about his habit of speaking in abstractions, gently reminding him to balance lofty ideals with practical consideration. Amid this peaceful rhythm, Lafayette remains aware of the simmering tensions beneath the city's surface. You follow him through neighborhoods where whispered grievances circulate, and young men debate their visions for the future. He listens carefully, absorbing the subtleties of public sentiment. Historians still argue whether his presence calmed revolutionary fervor or merely recorded it, but his attentive observation reflects a mind that seeks to understand before acting. Evenings are filled with correspondence and reflection. Lafayette writes letters to Washington and to allies across Europe, often pausing to sketch or mark small details that capture both landscapes and character traits of those he has met. A quirky anecdote: he once folded a tiny origami crane into a letter for a young friend, a delicate gesture that softened formal advice with warmth and care. These small acts reveal the human side of a man often remembered for public deeds rather than personal tenderness. In salons, he continues to encourage gentle debate, guiding conversations with soft questions and insightful commentary. Guests respond to his patience, the sense that their voices are valued, and the subtle merging of American revolutionary lessons with French political thought. You sense that this blend of listening, observing, and advising is precisely what allows Lafayette to remain influential without resorting to force or grandstanding. As night settles over the city, the warm glow of lamplight reflects off the Seine, and Lafayette finds a quiet balcony where he contemplates the day's encounters. The calm lapping of water, the distant songs of night birds, and the soft murmur of the city beneath create a moment of introspection. He considers both the challenges ahead and the lessons of the past, aware that patience, empathy, and subtle action may be as powerful as the sword or the pen. In this gentle balance, he moves forward quietly, thoughtfully, ever mindful of the delicate weave of public life and private reflection.
Autumn drifts softly into Paris, painting the city with muted golds and gentle reds, and Lafayette senses the changing currents of both weather and politics. You walk beside him through avenues lined with falling leaves,
the crisp air carrying a hint of smoke from hearths warming early evenings. Historians still argue whether his interventions in the unfolding revolutionary events truly shaped outcomes or merely reflected the currents already in motion. But his presence offers a measured, steadying influence that many quietly respect. During this season, Lafayette's mornings often begin with letters and reflections. You imagine him seated by a window where sunlight falls in gentle squares across parchment, quill in hand, noting both strategic thoughts and personal impressions. A small, lesser-known detail is that he sometimes pressed autumn leaves into these letters before sealing them, a practice blending observation of nature with correspondence, offering a subtle pause in the bustle of public life. These quiet rituals seem to calm his mind, fostering a patience that becomes vital in the months ahead. Adrian remains his companion in both thought and exploration. You watch them walking through small gardens where chrysanthemums bloom in soft clusters, sharing ideas and laughter. She encourages him to balance the weight of civic responsibility with moments of domestic ease, often teasing him about his habit of pacing while thinking aloud. Their gentle banter punctuates serious discussion, adding a rhythmic softness to the day's unfolding narrative. Lafayette continues to navigate salons and assemblies, gently bridging the gap between reformist thinkers and established nobility. You see him listening intently to concerns, guiding discussions with measured questions, and quietly shaping consensus. One quirky anecdote: he once arranged a small informal duel of wits where two debating scholars used riddles and puzzles to illustrate political principles, and he laughed softly at the ingenuity displayed. It is this combination of intellect, patience, and subtle humor that defines his approach to leadership. Amid public life, he does not neglect ordinary citizens. You follow him through narrow streets and market squares, observing his attention to small grievances, whispered hopes, and the rhythm of everyday life. Historians still debate whether these excursions were politically motivated or simply reflections of genuine curiosity, but the careful observation he practices ensures he remains attuned to the human side of societal change. Evenings are spent in quieter reflection. Lafayette reviews notes, sketches potential reforms, and sometimes reads poetry aloud to Adrian, the soft cadence of verse mingling with the distant hum of the city. Small, intimate moments, like sharing tea with a neighbor or listening to a child's laughter in a courtyard, add texture to his otherwise public life. You sense that these moments sustain him, grounding his ambitions in the gentle reality of lived experience. As darkness falls, you imagine Lafayette standing by a softly glowing lamp, the outlines of Paris touching beyond, his mind weaving together ideals, memories, and anticipations. The autumn air carries a serene chill, rustling leaves in quiet rhythms that mirror his contemplative pace. Here, in the balance of observation, reflection, and understated action, he embodies a model of leadership, both calm and attentive, a steady presence amid changing tides. Winter settles over Paris with a hushed grace, dusting rooftops and cobblestones with a pale frost, and you follow Lafayette through quiet streets wrapped in soft woolen coats and mufflers. The city seemed slower, its usual bustle tempered by shorter days and muted light, and historians still debate how the cold season shaped his engagements with both allies and adversaries. Yet the tranquility offers him time for reflection and careful planning. You imagine him moving through the frost-laden gardens of his estate, observing the stark beauty of bare branches and soft snow collecting on stone balustrades. One little-known detail is that Lafayette enjoyed tracing patterns in the frost with his gloved fingers, a simple meditative practice that mirrored his careful approach to political life. In these moments, you sense his mind balancing strategy with serenity, finding clarity in both natural observation and gentle contemplation. Adrienne walks nearby, her presence a warm counterpoint to the chill. You see them pausing to watch birds pecking through snow for seeds, sharing quiet smiles that seem to speak volumes without a single word. Together they discuss the coming months, domestic plans, and reflections on past experiences, their conversation carrying the soft cadence of routine and affection. Small domestic rituals, arranging fires, folding letters, or preparing tea, offer grounding, gentle stability amid a season of external uncertainty. In public life, Lafayette continues to advise, write, and communicate, often through letters that carry encouragement and thoughtful insight. You imagine him carefully drafting correspondence to Washington and other leaders, embedding observations and guidance with subtle empathy. A quirky anecdote: he once tucked a small pressed flower into a letter for a young supporter, a delicate gesture blending formal communication with personal care, reminding you that even men of grand ideas appreciate simple, tangible tokens of connection. He also attends smaller salons and gatherings, where conversation drifts like a soft river between philosophy, governance, and literature. You observe how he listens, asks gentle questions, and encourages thoughtful debate rather than insistence, fostering a quiet space for ideas to grow. Historians still argue whether such salons directly influenced revolutionary events, but it is clear that his approach nurtures understanding and reflection over spectacle. Evenings are long and serene. You see Lafayette by candlelight, reviewing maps, rereading letters, or quietly observing snowflakes on windowsills. The soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant echo of the city create a comforting rhythm, and he often reflects on lessons learned, patterns observed, and human collections sustained. These nightly meditations seem to shape both his personal philosophy and his public demeanor. As night deepens, you picture Lafayette standing near a frost-kissed balcony, gazing at softly lit streets and the muted flow of the Seine beneath winter skies. The silence of the city is a gentle companion, and the quiet rhythm of falling snow mirrors the calm patience that has guided his life. Here, in the heart of winter, he embodies a serene balance between reflection, observation, and measured action, preparing for the transformations the new year may bring. Spring arrives with a tender hush, and Paris awakens in muted pastels, the air scented with soft blossoms and fresh earth. You walk with Lafayette through streets that are slowly brightening, noticing buds along garden walls and the first hints of green returning to the chestnut trees. Historians still debate how much his presence influenced the early political awakenings of this season, yet you sense that his steady guidance, calm observation, and gentle engagement quietly shaped the rhythms of those around him. You follow him to quieter neighborhoods where artisans begin their day, the clinking of tools mingling with soft birdsong. One small, lesser-known tidbit is that Lafayette often paused to speak with local craftsmen, not merely out of courtesy, but to understand the practical workings of everyday life, grounding his philosophical and political ideals in lived experience. You notice how he listens, nods, and occasionally offers subtle advice, a soft presence among those who might otherwise feel overlooked. Adrienne accompanies him through sunlit avenues and flower-filled courtyards, her laughter blending with the gentle stirrings of spring. You observe their tender interactions, small gestures of encouragement, and moments of shared contemplation, each one reinforcing a sense of equilibrium between personal warmth and public responsibility. Her quiet strength balances his restless energy, ensuring that he remains both grounded and attentive. In salons and gatherings, Lafayette continues to navigate political and philosophical conversations with grace. He introduces ideas softly, weaving American revolutionary principles into French debates with patience and subtlety. A quirky anecdote: during one discussion, he used a simple folding fan to illustrate a point about expanding rights and contracting powers, prompting quiet laughter and reflection among guests. These delicate moments show that humor, lightness, and imagination accompany even serious discourse. His correspondence remains an essential aspect of his work. You imagine him sitting by the window with morning light filtering through curtains, writing letters to friends, allies, and confidants. The ink flows slowly, and occasionally he pauses to press a small blossom between pages, a tender reminder that beauty and care persist even in serious tasks. Historians still argue about the impact of these letters, but they reveal the persistence of a gentle and attentive mind. Evenings in spring carry a lingering warmth. You picture Lafayette on a balcony overlooking Paris, petals drifting on the breeze, reflecting on the growth of both the city and himself. The soft hum of distant activity, the faint ripple of the Seine, and the occasional chirp of early evening birds create a gentle soundtrack for reflection. He contemplates how observation, patience, and empathy shape human interactions, reminding you that the most enduring influence often comes not from force, but from quiet attentiveness. As night falls, you feel the lingering serenity of spring settling around him. The streets grow softer under twilight, and the fragrance of blossoms lingers in the air. Lafayette's life, a tapestry of observation, action, and reflection, continues in gentle rhythm, preparing him for the coming moments of history, guided by the calm awareness that lasting change often begins in quiet, thoughtful gestures.
Summer arrives slowly, stretching long golden days across Paris and the countryside, and you walk beside Lafayette as the sun warms cobblestones and soft breezes carry the scent of blooming flowers. Historians still debate how his personal vision shaped later political movements, yet you sense that his presence leaves a subtle, enduring imprint, one that resonates quietly among friends, allies, and even casual observers. The city hums with life, but Lafayette moves with a composed attentiveness, noticing details that others might overlook. You watch him wandering through sunlit gardens, where roses and lavender sway gently, and small birds flit from branch to branch. One lesser-known detail is that Lafayette often paused mid-walk to sketch the arrangement of petals or the curve of a leaf, an exercise that mirrors his careful attention to both natural patterns and the complexities of human affairs. These quiet observations nurture a reflective patience, shaping the calm decisiveness that defines his leadership. Adrienne accompanies him, a steady presence of warmth and companionship. You notice how they share gentle laughter over small domestic moments, arranging flowers, noting seasonal changes, or simply pausing to breathe in the fragrance of summer air. Their shared life blends affection and mutual respect, forming a foundation for his ongoing work in the public sphere. These tender rhythms soften the weight of responsibility, reminding you that even historical figures experience life's gentle, intimate joys. In salons and gatherings, Lafayette continues to engage with thinkers, reformers, and diplomats, offering guidance through measured words and thoughtful questions.
A quirky anecdote, he once suggested settling a lively debate over agricultural reform by inviting participants to taste different cheeses, turning theory into a softly humorous sensory experience. Historians still argue whether such moments carried real influence, but they illustrate his blend of intellect, humor, and patience. Letters and correspondence remain central to his days. You imagine him seated beneath a wide window, sunlight illuminating his papers as he writes with deliberate care, occasionally pausing to press a fragrant bloom into a note. These letters, gentle yet insightful, reach friends and allies across continents, carrying both ideas and subtle reminders of human connection. Evenings are serene. You picture Lafayette on a quiet balcony, the sun dipping low over the Seine, painting soft reflections on the water. The city's distant hum fades into gentle murmurs, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of summer insects. He reflects on a life spent observing, guiding, and connecting, finding fulfillment not in acclaim, but in the subtle, lasting effects of measured action and attentive care. As night deepens, you feel the full arc of his life, from youthful curiosity to mature wisdom, winding gently into a calm conclusion. His story, threaded with patience, reflection, and quiet determination, settles softly like the final notes of a lullaby. You take a slow breath and let the serene rhythm of history carry you forward, leaving a sense of gentle wonder and quiet peace. Now, as you settle further into the quiet of the evening, allow yourself to linger on the soft edges of Lafayette's life, tracing the gentle arcs of his experiences and the rhythms that shaped him. Imagine him in the last light of summer, watching petals drift in a warm breeze, the distant murmur of Parisian streets a muted soundtrack to his reflections. Everything slows here, and the weight of urgency fades, leaving only the calm continuity of observation, connection, and gentle influence. You can picture the small, tender gestures that defined his days, the careful folding of letters, the delicate pressing of a flower, the soft laughter shared with Adrienne in sunlit corridors. Even in moments of public significance, these quiet actions remind you that human life is built as much on attentiveness and care as on grand gestures. Historians still argue over the precise impact of his choices, yet the consistent thread is one of patience and reflection, a life lived with soft attentiveness to both people and principle. Now imagine the seasons turning again, the soft whisper of wind through the trees, and the delicate play of light across water and stone. Lafayette's life was shaped by these rhythms, the steady accumulation of small, thoughtful actions that together created a lasting legacy. You can almost hear the gentle cadence of his days, the quiet exchange of ideas, the subtle guidance, and the gentle laughter, each note contributing to a soft, harmonious whole. As you drift further into this calm, let the image of him standing quietly on a balcony, bathed in the glow of evening, settle in your mind. The story of a life spent bridging worlds, observing deeply, and acting with care, offers a gentle reminder of the quiet power of patience, reflection, and subtle influence. You carry this calm with you, like a soft lantern illuminating the night. Feel your own breath slow, your thoughts soften, and the serene legacy of Lafayette's life drift with you into the gentle darkness. Let the quiet sense of continuity, connection, and purpose ease you to rest, leaving a lingering sense of peace, reflection, and gentle wonder.